High in the hills of Beverly Hills, where the city lights glimmer like scattered diamonds against the California night, there once stood a ranch-style mansion that witnessed some of Hollywood's most legendary nights. This is the dark story of Dean Martin's estate, a house that held laughter, tragedy, and the slow unraveling of an American dream. At first, it was a modest dream home purchased for $120,000 by a former steel mill worker who had somehow become the king of cool. Within its wood and fieldstone walls, the Rat Pack gathered, champagne flowed until dawn, and Frank Sinatra himself spoke of evenings of fun that would become Hollywood legend. But this house was never just a celebrity residence. It was a monument to the immigrant son who dropped out of high school in 10th grade and fought as Kid Crochet in smoky boxing rings for pocket change. A man who spoke only Italian until he was 5 years old, who watched his father cut hair in Steubenville, Ohio, while dreaming of something bigger than the steel mills that blackened the sky. The house at 601 Mountain Drive became proof that those dreams could come true, that a barber's son from the Rust Belt could build paradise in the California sun. But paradise, it turned out, was temporary. The mansion that once echoed with Sinatra's voice and Martin's trademark lazy charm would be demolished, erased, replaced by something bigger and colder that carried no memory of what came before. How did one man's dream home become so forgotten that developers could tear it down without a second thought? And what does its disappearance say about how quickly America forgets the people it once worshipped? If you enjoy deep investigations into old Hollywood estates and the families who built them, please like, subscribe and tell me in the comments which lost mansion to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. The story begins not in Beverly Hills, but in Steubenville, Ohio, a gritty steel town on the Ohio River where the sky ran gray with factory smoke and men broke their backs for wages that barely covered rent. Dino Paul Crocetti was born there on June 7, 1917, the second son of Gaetano Alfonso Crocetti and Angela Barra Crocetti. Gaetano had emigrated from Montesilvano in the Abruzzo region of Italy, arriving in America with nothing but the barber's trade he had learned back home. Angela was born in Ohio to Italian immigrants who had made the same desperate crossing years earlier. The Crocetti household spoke Italian at home exclusively. Young Dino understood no English when he started school, which immediately marked him as different, foreign, slightly suspect in a town where nativism ran deep and the children of immigrants learned early to keep their heads down. His father worked long hours in his small barbershop, cutting hair for steelworkers who came in covered in grime, their hands scarred from years of labor. The shop provided enough for a modest but stable life, better than many immigrant families managed. They had a house, not luxurious, but solid. They had food on the table. They had heat in winter. By the standards of immigrant Steubenville, the Crocettis were doing okay. But Dino watched his father work those long hours, saw the exhaustion in his eyes at the end of each day, and understood instinctively that this was not the life he wanted. He spent his afternoons at the movie theaters, particularly when Bing Crosby pictures came to town. He would stay all day, watching the same film multiple times, studying Crosby's effortless cool, the way he made singing look as natural as breathing. Something sparked in him during those hours in the dark, a sense that there was another world beyond the steel mills and barbershops, a world where men wore tuxedos instead of work boots, where they smiled instead of grimacing under the weight of physical labor, where life itself seemed lighter, easier, almost weightless. But Steubenville was not a place that encouraged dreams. It was a place that demanded practicality, that rewarded hard work with just enough money to survive and keep working. Dino dropped out of Steubenville High School in 10th grade, not because he was stupid, but because school felt irrelevant to someone who already knew the script his life was supposed to follow. Work in the mills, marry a local girl, raise children who would work in the mills, repeat until death. So he went to work, taking whatever jobs he could find. At 16, he entered the steel mill, doing backbreaking labor in heat that felt like hell itself. The noise was relentless, a constant roar of machinery that damaged hearing and frayed nerves. The dangers were everywhere: molten metal, heavy equipment, exhausted workers making fatal mistakes. Men died in the mills regularly, their deaths barely noted in local papers, just another cost of keeping America's industrial machine running. Dino hated it, hated the heat, the noise, the grinding repetition, the way the mill reduced men to interchangeable parts in a system that valued production over humanity. He tried boxing for a while, billing himself as Kid Crochet, a play on his last name. He fought 12 bouts and won. By his own later admission, exactly one. The boxing left him with a broken nose that was later straightened, a scarred lip, broken knuckles from fights where he could not afford the tape boxers used to wrap their hands, and a body that ached in ways he would feel decades later. But boxing taught him something crucial: how to perform, how to command attention, how to make people watch even when you were losing. These were skills that would serve him far better than anything the steel mill could teach. At 17, Dino started singing in clubs near Steubenville, then expanded to Cleveland and eventually New York. His voice was not technically perfect, not in the trained classical sense, but it had something else: warmth, ease, a kind of intimate casualness that made listeners feel like he was singing just to them. He changed his name to Dean Martin in 1940, shedding Dino Crocetti like an old skin, becoming someone new, someone American, someone who could move through doors that stayed closed to immigrant sons. The name change was strategic, a recognition that ethnic Italian names carried baggage in 1940s America, that assimilation required certain sacrifices, that success meant becoming what the audience wanted to see rather than what you actually were. By 1946, Martin had been struggling for years, getting gigs but never quite breaking through to real success. Then he met Jerry Lewis in Atlantic City. Lewis was a young comedian with manic energy and rubber-faced physical comedy. Martin was the smooth, straight man, the crooner who could sing a ballad and then deadpan his way through Lewis's anarchic routines. The chemistry was instant and undeniable. Within months, Martin and Lewis were the hottest act in nightclubs across America. Within a year, they had a radio show. By 1949, they were making movies. The partnership made both men rich beyond anything Dino Crocetti could have imagined back in Steubenville. They were earning millions, playing to sold-out crowds, their faces on magazine covers, their names known in households from coast to coast. The immigrant son who had dropped out of high school, who had fought as Kid Crochet for pocket change, who had sweated in the steel mills, had somehow become a star. Success brought Martin to California in the late 1940s. He had divorced his first wife, Betty McDonald, with whom he had 4 children. The marriage had not survived the pressures of fame, the constant travel, the temptations that came with being young, good-looking, and suddenly wealthy. In 1949, he married Jeanne Bieger, and they began building what Martin hoped would be a more stable family life. As the 1950s began, Martin and Lewis were at their peak. The movies were hits. The nightclub appearances sold out instantly. The money poured in at rates that seemed almost unreal. Martin began looking for a permanent Los Angeles home, something that would signal that he had arrived, that he belonged, that the kid from Steubenville was now part of Hollywood royalty. He found it in the prime estate section of Beverly Hills on Mountain Drive, one of the most prestigious streets in the city. The property sat on 16 acres, an enormous lot by Beverly Hills standards, with sweeping views and the kind of privacy that celebrities craved. The existing house was modest, a wooden fieldstone ranch-style structure, nothing ostentatious, built with understated elegance that appealed to Martin's sensibility. He and Jeanne purchased it for $120,000, a substantial sum in the early 1950s, but a fraction of what comparable properties cost today. The price reflected the fact that the house, while well-built and beautifully situated, was not a mansion in the traditional sense. It was approximately 5,000 square feet, large but not overwhelming, with clean lines and a connection to the surrounding landscape that felt more like a comfortable estate than a palace. For Martin, the house represented something profound. It was proof that a boy who had spoken only Italian until kindergarten, who had dropped out of school, who had broken his body in boxing rings and steel mills, could own property in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in America. Proof that the dreams he had nursed in those dark Steubenville movie theaters, watching Bing Crosby, were not foolish. Proof that reinvention was possible, that Dino Crocetti could become Dean Martin, and Dean Martin could become someone who belonged on Mountain Drive. He and Jean immediately began planning expansions. The original 500 square feet was comfortable for a family, but not adequate for the life Martin now lived. A life that required space for entertaining, for hosting the industry friends who were increasingly central to his career and social identity, for accommodating a growing family that would eventually include 7 children from his second marriage. Over the next several years, they more than doubled the size of the house, expanding it to approximately 12,000 square feet. The additions maintained the original ranch aesthetic, wood and stone construction, low horizontal lines, large windows that brought in California sunlight and framed views of the hills. The expansion was done carefully, with attention to architectural integrity, so the house never felt like a mismatch of styles. It was by all accounts a dream ranch, exactly the kind of place Martin had envisioned when he started making real money. The construction of the expanded estate required an army of workers. Carpenters, stonemasons, electricians, plumbers, landscapers, all of them laboring in the California sun to realize Martin's vision of domestic paradise. Most were working-class men, many of them immigrants or the sons of immigrants, not so different from Martin's own background except that they had not gotten lucky, had not possessed that particular combination of talent, timing, and relentless ambition that could transform a Steubenville steel mill worker into a Beverly Hills homeowner. The work was hard and often dangerous. Scaffolding could collapse, power tools could slip. Heat exhaustion was common in summer months. The pay was decent by the standards of the time, better than factory work, but nothing that would allow these workers to dream of owning property anywhere near Mountain Drive. They built Martin's paradise, then went home to their own modest houses in less fashionable neighborhoods, carrying the physical toll of construction in their backs and shoulders, accepting without much complaint the fundamental inequality that defined their relationship to the estate. Martin, to his credit, was reportedly courteous to workers, remembering names, asking about families, tipping generously at Christmas. He had not forgotten where he came from. He still told stories about Steubenville, about his father's barbershop, about the steel mills. But there was a distance now, an unbridgeable gap between the man who owned the estate and the men who built it. Martin's wealth had lifted him into a different class entirely, one where labor was something you purchased rather than something you did. The mansion functioned because of this division. The beautiful rooms, the manicured grounds, the seamless entertaining, all of it required constant, often invisible work by people Martin employed, but whose lives remained fundamentally separate from his own. By the late 1950s, the Martin and Lewis partnership was crumbling. The split, when it came in 1956, was acrimonious and shocked fans who had seen them as inseparable. Publicly, both men claimed the breakup was amicable, just creative differences and a natural end to a successful run. Privately, there was bitterness, resentment, and hurt feelings that would take decades to heal. Many industry insiders predicted Martin would fade without Lewis. Comedy was Lewis's strength. Martin was just the singer, the straight man, a supporting player whose solo career would flop. They were spectacularly wrong. Martin's solo career took off almost immediately. His recordings, smooth romantic ballads and up-tempo numbers delivered with his trademark relaxed style, became massive hits. That's Amore became one of the defining songs of the decade. He appeared in serious dramatic films like The Young Lions, alongside Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift, proving he could act when given the opportunity. And most importantly, he became part of the Rat Pack, the group of entertainers led by Frank Sinatra that defined 1960s cool. The Rat Pack, Sinatra, Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, was more than a performing group. It was a lifestyle, a philosophy, a way of being in the world that emphasized effortless, cool male camaraderie, late nights, beautiful women, and an almost defiant refusal to take anything too seriously. They performed together in Las Vegas, made movies together, socialized constantly, and turned their friendship into an industry. Martin fit perfectly into this world. His laid-back persona, his apparent ease with fame and fortune, his ability to drink heavily without seeming drunk, all made him the ideal Rat Pack member. He was Sinatra's best friend, the one who could match him drink for drink, joke for joke, and still hit his marks when the cameras rolled. The parties at 601 Mountain Drive became legendary during this period. Sinatra mentioned them from the stage in Las Vegas, referencing evenings of fun that happened at Martin's house, hinting at excesses that could not be fully described in public. The guest lists read like a who's who of Hollywood royalty: actors, directors, musicians, powerful studio executives, all gathered at Martin's estate for nights that stretched until dawn. The drink flowed constantly, usually high-quality scotch and vodka, though Martin himself famously filled his glass with apple juice during performances, cultivating the drunk persona without actually impairing himself. The atmosphere was sophisticated but loose, formal enough to maintain the sense of exclusivity, but relaxed enough that people felt comfortable, could let their guard down, could be themselves, or at least the versions of themselves they showed to other celebrities. Music filled the house. Martin would sometimes sing, accompanied by a piano player he kept on call. Sinatra would join in. Davis would perform. These were not rehearsed performances, but spontaneous moments of artistry between friends who also happened to be among the best entertainers in the world. The walls absorbed these sounds, these voices, these notes that would never be recorded or preserved except in the memories of those present. During these parties, the staff moved invisibly through the house. Bartenders kept glasses filled. Waiters circulated with trays of food. Housekeepers cleaned up the inevitable spills and messes. Drivers waited to take drunk guests home safely. All of this labor was essential to maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance, of nights that just happened without planning or effort. The workers were paid well by the standards of domestic service, but they worked long hours, often until 3 or 4 in the morning, and their presence was meant to be noticed only when something went wrong. They were the machinery that kept Martin's social world functioning, and like all machinery, they were expected to run quietly and reliably without demanding attention. Beneath the parties and the glamour, Martin was building a substantial career as a solo performer. His television variety show, The Dean Martin Show, premiered in 1965 and ran for 9 years, becoming one of the most popular programs on television. The show's format was famously relaxed. Martin seemed perpetually on the verge of not caring, reading cue cards with barely concealed amusement, forgetting lines, treating the whole enterprise as if it were an elaborate joke he was letting the audience in on. This calculated casualness was actually the result of meticulous preparation and professional discipline, but the illusion was perfect. Viewers loved him precisely because he seemed not to be trying too hard, because he made stardom look easy. The show made Martin even wealthier. By the late 1960s, he was one of the highest-paid entertainers in America. The money allowed him to maintain the Mountain Drive estate at a level that required constant investment. Property taxes alone ran into tens of thousands of dollars annually. Maintenance costs were substantial: landscaping, pool service, repairs to aging systems, upgrades to keep the house modern. The staff payroll was significant. Martin employed a full-time house manager, multiple housekeepers, groundskeepers, a personal assistant, drivers, and security personnel. The house consumed money at a rate that would have bankrupted most Americans, but for Martin in his prime, it was easily affordable. The estate became a sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the demands of fame, play golf, spend time with his children, and live the life he had always imagined back in Steubenville. But the house also witnessed the beginning of Martin's slow unraveling. The 1970s brought changes that Martin struggled to navigate. His television show ended in 1974. His movie career was winding down. The Rat Pack era, with its particular brand of masculine cool, was starting to feel dated in a decade defined by disco, feminism, and a younger generation that found the old Vegas act slightly embarrassing. Martin kept working, performing in Las Vegas and Reno, touring when he felt like it, but the ease and joy that had characterized his earlier career were fading. He was drinking more, not apple juice anymore, but real alcohol, and the charming drunk persona was becoming harder to distinguish from actual alcoholism. His marriage to Jeanne fell apart, ending in divorce in 1973 after 24 years. The reasons were complex: the usual accumulation of resentments and incompatibilities that marriages accumulate over decades, compounded by the specific pressures of celebrity life. Martin had been unfaithful. Jeanne had grown tired of the drinking and the long absences. The children were mostly grown. There was not enough left to keep them together. Martin married again in 1973 to a much younger woman named Catherine Horn. The marriage lasted 3 years and was by most accounts miserable. His third divorce left him increasingly isolated. The children from his second marriage were building their own lives, some successfully, some struggling with the particular burdens of being Dean Martin's kids. The house on Mountain Drive, which had been built to accommodate a large family, now felt cavernous and empty. The rooms that had once echoed with children's voices and Rat Pack laughter were quiet, filled only with Martin and whatever staff were working that day. Then came the tragedy that would define Martin's final years. On March 21, 1987, his son Dean Paul Martin, a pilot in the California Air National Guard, died when his F-4 Phantom jet crashed into a mountain during a training mission. Dean Paul, known as Dino, was 35 years old. He had been a professional tennis player, an actor, a genuinely talented young man trying to build his own identity separate from his famous father. His death shattered Dean Martin in ways that friends said he never recovered from. The man who had always projected cool detachment, who had made a career of seeming like nothing could touch him, was suddenly and visibly broken. He withdrew from public life almost completely. The performances in Las Vegas, which had been his bread and butter for decades, mostly stopped. He appeared occasionally for contractual obligations, but without the old spark. The drinking intensified. He spent more and more time alone at the Mountain Drive house, sitting in rooms filled with memories of better times, unable or unwilling to move forward. The house itself was aging along with Martin. Systems that had been installed in the 1950s and 1960s needed replacement. Paint was fading. Wood was weathering. The grounds, once immaculate, started showing signs of neglect as Martin cut back on staff and maintenance to save money. His income had dropped dramatically. Without regular performances, without new projects, he was living on savings and investments that, while substantial, were not infinite. The mansion that had symbolized his triumph now felt like a weight, an expensive burden he could neither maintain properly nor abandon. Martin sold the Mountain Drive estate in 1988 for approximately $9 million, a substantial profit over what he had paid, but less than the property might have commanded in better condition. He moved to a different house in Beverly Hills, a smaller place at 2002 Loma Vista Drive in Trousdale Estates. The new house was comfortable but modest compared to the Mountain Drive property. It felt like a retreat, a scaling back, an acknowledgement that the days of grand entertaining and large families were over. Martin would spend his final years in this house, increasingly isolated, rarely leaving, seeing only a handful of close friends. He died there on Christmas Day, 1995, alone, except for a housekeeper who found him. The cause was acute respiratory failure, the result of decades of smoking. He was 78 years old. His death received significant media coverage. The obituaries celebrated his contributions to entertainment, his status as a member of the Rat Pack, his smooth voice and cool persona. But the coverage felt oddly perfunctory, as if Martin was already half forgotten, a figure from an era that seemed increasingly distant. The outpouring of grief that accompanied Sinatra's death 3 years later was notably absent for Martin. He had outlived his era, and his death felt like the final closing of a chapter that had already ended years before. The house on Mountain Drive, the place where he had raised children, hosted Sinatra, built his dream of the immigrant's son made good, had already moved on to other owners, other stories. The estate's new owners were Guilford and Diane Glazer. Guilford Glazer was a commercial real estate developer who had made his fortune building shopping malls, including the massive Del Amo Fashion Center in Torrance. He had the kind of wealth that made even Martin's success look modest by comparison. The Glazers had a vision for the property that had nothing to do with preserving Martin's legacy. They wanted to build something entirely new, something that reflected their own taste and status. In the mid-1990s, shortly after purchasing the property, they demolished Martin's house completely. The wood and fieldstone ranch, the rooms where the Rat Pack had gathered, the spaces where Martin's children had grown up, all of it was razed. Bulldozers tore down walls, crushed the stone, hauled away debris in dump trucks. The demolition took weeks. When it was done, nothing remained of the structure Martin had called home for nearly 2 decades. It was as if the house had never existed. The Glazers commissioned architect Fred Briggs to design a replacement. Briggs created something dramatically different, a massive concrete and glass structure of approximately 27,500 square feet, more than twice the size of Martin's expanded ranch. The new house was aggressively modern, all clean lines and open spaces, with a museum-like aesthetic that prioritized dramatic architectural statements over warmth or comfort. The design reflected Glazer's background in commercial development. The scale was enormous, the materials were expensive, and the overall effect was impressive in a cold, impersonal way. The new estate could accommodate over 1,000 guests. It had multiple entertaining spaces, elaborate water features, theatrical lighting, and all the amenities that extreme wealth could purchase. But it had no connection to the property's history, no acknowledgement that Dean Martin had lived there, no trace of the ranch-style house that had stood on the site for 4 decades. Guilford Glazer died in 2014. His wife Diane died in 2019. The estate they had built on Martin's land went on the market with an asking price of $75 million. The listing materials mentioned Martin in passing, noting that the property had once been his estate, but the emphasis was entirely on the Glazers' construction, on the modern mansion and its capabilities. Martin had become a footnote, a piece of trivia that added a hint of Hollywood history without actually meaning anything substantial. The house did not sell at $75 million. It sat on the market for years, the price dropping steadily. In 2022, it finally sold for $40 million, barely half the original asking price, and a figure that real estate analysts considered disappointing for such a prime location. The new owners, represented by an LLC, remained largely anonymous. The property would continue its existence as a trophy home for the ultra-wealthy, passed from one billionaire to another, its connection to Martin fading further with each transaction. The demolition of Martin's house was not unique. Across Los Angeles, particularly in Beverly Hills and Bel Air, old estates were being torn down constantly to make way for newer, larger structures. The pattern was relentless. A classic house built in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, or 50s would be purchased by a developer or wealthy buyer who saw the land value rather than the historical value. The existing structure would be demolished. A new mega mansion would rise in its place, often 3 or 4 times larger, designed in whatever contemporary style was currently fashionable. The cycle erased architectural history block by block, replacing human-scaled houses with monuments to extreme wealth that had no connection to the communities or eras they replaced. Preservationists fought these demolitions when they could, arguing for historical designation, for architectural significance, for cultural memory. But private property rights usually won. Owners could do what they wanted with their land, and what they usually wanted was bigger, newer, more impressive, regardless of what was lost in the process. The disappearance of Martin's house raises uncomfortable questions about cultural memory and whose stories survive. Sinatra's homes have been preserved with plaques and careful documentation. His Palm Springs compound is maintained as a retreat and event space, marketed explicitly on its connection to the chairman of the board. Marilyn Monroe's homes are landmarks that draw pilgrims. James Dean's childhood house is a museum, but Martin's Mountain Drive estate was erased without ceremony or protest, as if it did not matter, as if his version of Hollywood history was disposable. Part of this reflects Martin's own personality. He cultivated detachment, never took himself too seriously, avoided the kind of self-mythologizing that Sinatra embraced. That cool, laid-back persona made him beloved during his lifetime, but may have worked against his legacy. He left no clear sense that he cared about being remembered, and perhaps as a result, the culture has not worked very hard to remember him. Part of it reflects changing tastes. The Rat Pack aesthetic, with its emphasis on masculine, cool, heavy drinking, and a certain casual misogyny that was acceptable in the 1960s, has not aged particularly well. Contemporary audiences are more likely to cringe at old Rat Pack routines than to find them charming. Martin's legacy is complicated by these shifts in cultural values, making him harder to celebrate without caveats, and part of it reflects simple economics. The land on Mountain Drive is worth tens of millions of dollars. The house sitting on that land, no matter how historically significant, is worth whatever someone is willing to pay for it as a functional residence. If buyers want new construction rather than a preserved 1950s ranch, the market accommodates them. Cultural memory in this equation has no dollar value and therefore no power. Yet Martin's story deserves more than a footnote in someone else's real estate listing. The trajectory of his life, from Steubenville's steel mills to Beverly Hills' most exclusive addresses, represents a particular version of the American dream that feels increasingly remote. The idea that someone could drop out of high school, work brutal manual labor, struggle for years, and then through talent and timing achieve not just success, but genuine cultural importance. That narrative has become harder to believe as economic mobility has declined and class barriers have solidified. Martin's generation, people born in the 1910s and 20s, experienced a window of opportunity that was in many ways unique. The post-war economic boom, the expansion of entertainment industries, the GI Bill for those who served, all created pathways upward that had not existed before and have not existed since in quite the same way. Martin benefited from this moment. His talent was real, his work ethic was undeniable. But he also got lucky in ways that are difficult to replicate. The immigrant son story that his career embodied, the rags-to-riches narrative that the Mountain Drive house represented, these were never as common as American mythology suggests, and they have become even rarer in an era of stagnant wages, skyrocketing housing costs, and fortunes increasingly built on inheritance rather than individual achievement. Martin's estate was not just a house. It was evidence that the system could sometimes work for people who started with nothing, that merit and luck could occasionally combine to lift someone across class boundaries that usually proved impenetrable. The demolition of that house, then, is not just the loss of a building, but the erasure of evidence, a choice, conscious or not, to forget that such trajectories were once possible. The workers who built Martin's ranch and the workers who demolished it decades later occupy similar positions in these narratives. They are essential to every part of the story, the construction, the maintenance, the destruction, and yet they are almost completely absent from how the story gets told. We know Dean Martin's name. We know Guilford Glazer's name. We do not know the names of the carpenters who expanded Martin's house or the construction workers who tore it down. We do not know what they thought about the work, whether they took pride in craftsmanship or simply tried to get through their shifts without injury. We do not know if any of them recognized the irony of destroying a house built by men just like themselves for a man who had started out just like them. This invisibility is structural. The stories we tell about real estate, about wealth, about success, almost always center on the people who own rather than the people who build. The owner's vision matters. The owner's taste is studied. The owner's biography is preserved. The workers are backdrop interchangeable, their individual identities and experiences irrelevant to the larger narrative. This pattern repeats across every mansion, every estate, every monument to private wealth. But it does not have to be this way. A different history of Martin's estate would center the workers, would name them when possible, would describe their labor in detail, would acknowledge that the beauty and functionality of the house depended entirely on their skill and effort. It would recognize that Martin's wealth, while earned through his own talent, was also produced and sustained by an entire ecosystem of workers whose contributions made his lifestyle possible. It would ask what those workers earned, whether it was enough, whether the system that allowed Martin to accumulate millions while they earned wages was just or merely legal. These are uncomfortable questions because they force attention to structures we usually prefer not to examine too closely. Martin himself never fully grappled with these contradictions. He remembered Steubenville fondly, told stories about the barbershop and the steel mills, contributed money to causes in his hometown. But he did not translate that memory into any kind of systematic thought about labor, inequality, or economic justice. He enjoyed his wealth, spent it freely, and seemed to believe that anyone with sufficient talent and determination could follow his path. This was the common belief among successful people of his generation, a faith in American meritocracy that did not account for all the ways the system was rigged, all the doors that stayed closed regardless of merit, all the people who worked just as hard as Martin, but never got lucky. His philanthropy was generous but traditional, giving to established charities, supporting Catholic institutions, helping individuals in need. It was kindness without critique, charity without politics. Giving that made him feel good, without challenging the systems that created the need for charity in the first place. This was not hypocrisy. Martin genuinely believed he had gotten lucky and wanted to help others, but it reflected a limited understanding of how wealth and poverty are produced, a failure to see that his success and others' struggles were not separate phenomena, but two sides of the same economic arrangements. The house on Mountain Drive embodied this tension. It was simultaneously evidence of what was possible and a monument to what was not available to most people. It inspired dreams while also demonstrating how far most people were from realizing those dreams. And when it was demolished, that tension was not resolved but simply erased, replaced by a new set of contradictions that the Glazer mansion embodied in its own way. Now, all that remains of Martin's estate are photographs, mostly taken for architectural magazines in the 1950s and 60s, when the house was new and fashionable. These images show the ranch at its peak, before the neglect of Martin's final years, before the demolition. They reveal a house that was genuinely beautiful in an understated way, that prioritized livability over ostentation, that reflected Martin's own personality, confident but not showy, expensive but not gaudy. Looking at these photographs now, knowing that the house no longer exists, produces a strange melancholy. The people in the pictures are gone. The house is gone, the moment is gone. All of it has been swept away by time and real estate economics and changing tastes. What remains is only the image, a two-dimensional record of a three-dimensional reality that cannot be recovered. The melancholy is compounded by the knowledge that Martin's cultural presence is fading too. Younger generations know Sinatra. They do not necessarily know Martin. His music occasionally appears in period films or retro-themed commercials, but it does not stream the way Sinatra's does. His movies are not regularly revived or discussed. His television show is not rerun. He is becoming a name without a face, a reference without context, a piece of trivia, rather than a living presence in cultural memory. This forgetting is not inevitable. It is a choice, or rather a series of small choices, each one seeming insignificant on its own. The choice not to designate his estate as historically significant. The choice not to include him in documentaries about the Rat Pack era. The choice not to reissue his recordings or stream his television shows. The choice not to teach his work in courses on American popular culture. Each of these choices seems minor, but cumulatively they produce erasure. They determine who gets remembered and who disappears, whose houses become shrines and whose get demolished for new construction. The story of Dean Martin's estate is ultimately a story about impermanence, about how even the most solid-seeming success can vanish, how houses built to last generations can be torn down in weeks, how reputations that seem unshakable can fade within a single lifetime. It is about the gap between what we build and what survives, between what we achieve and what is remembered. Martin built a career that made him wealthy and famous. He built a house that sheltered his family and hosted legends. He built a public persona that defined cool for an entire generation. And yet, less than 30 years after his death, much of this has disappeared. The house is gone, the career is fading from memory, the persona feels dated. What remains is a cautionary tale about the limits of individual legacy, about how little control we have over how we are remembered, about the way history makes its own choices about who matters and who does not. This impermanence is not unique to Martin. Every celebrity faces it. Every wealthy person discovers that money cannot buy immortality, that estates get sold, that mansions get demolished, that even the most carefully constructed legacies eventually crumble. The question is not whether this will happen, but how we respond to it. Do we fight to preserve what came before, even when it is inconvenient or expensive? Do we accept loss as inevitable and focus on creating new things? Do we find ways to honor the past while still moving forward? These are not easy questions, and the answers vary depending on what is being lost and who is making the decisions. In Martin's case, the choice was made to let the house go, to prioritize new construction over historical preservation, to value land over legacy. That choice was legal and probably economically rational, but it was still a loss. Not just of a building, but of a tangible connection to a particular moment in Hollywood history. a specific version of the American dream, an individual life lived with talent and struggle and ultimate success. If there is a lesson in Martin's story, it might be about gratitude. Gratitude for what we have while we have it, knowing it will not last. Gratitude for the workers who build and maintain the spaces we inhabit, whose labor makes our lives possible. Gratitude for the cultural moments that produce beauty and joy, even when those moments are fleeting. Martin himself seemed to understand this instinctively. His famous cool was partly about not taking things too seriously, about enjoying the moment without clinging too desperately to it, about accepting that nothing lasts forever, and that is okay. He did not build monuments to himself. He did not seem to care much about being remembered. He lived, he performed, he made people laugh and swoon, and when it was over, it was over. There is something admirable in that attitude, something that resists the egotism that drives so many celebrities to constantly curate their legacies. But there is also something sad about it, a resignation that your work will not endure, that the house you built will be torn down, that the life you lived will be forgotten. Perhaps the answer is somewhere between these poles, between desperate legacy building and complete indifference. Perhaps the goal is to do good work, to treat people well, to create beautiful things, and then let them go, trusting that whatever deserves to survive will find a way to survive, and accepting that much will not. Martin's house is gone, but the music remains, at least for now. The Rat Pack performances are gone, but the films can still be watched. The parties are gone, but the stories persist, getting hazier and more mythical with each retelling. This is what we do with loss. We keep the pieces we can keep and mourn what slips away. The lot at 601 Mountain Drive still exists, of course. The Glazer mansion still sits there, cold and concrete and enormous. Wealthy people still live behind its walls, though their names and stories remain largely unknown to the public. The street is still prestigious. The property taxes are still astronomical. The California sun still warms the hills. Nothing has changed except everything has changed. The story the property tells now is different. A story about mall developers and modern architecture, and the kind of wealth that has nothing to do with talent or performance or the American dream as Martin understood it. Whether this new story is better or worse is a matter of perspective. What is undeniable is that the old story is gone, demolished as completely as the house itself, surviving only in memories and photographs and narratives like this one. And someday, probably sooner than anyone expects, the Glazer mansion will be torn down too. New owners will decide it is dated or inefficient or simply not to their taste. They will call in the bulldozers, and the cycle will repeat. The land will remain, the people will change, the stories will fade. This is the nature of property in a capitalist system where everything is always for sale, where permanence is an illusion, where today's dream home is tomorrow's teardown. Understanding this does not make the loss any easier, but it provides context, a sense that Martin's story is part of a larger pattern, that his demolished house is one of thousands demolished, and thousands more that will be demolished, that cultural memory is always fragile, always contested, always at risk. The challenge is to remember anyway, to tell the stories even when the buildings are gone, to insist that the past matters even when the present seems determined to erase it. This is why we return to these histories, why we investigate forgotten mansions, why we care about old houses and dead celebrities. Not out of nostalgia, though there is always some of that, but out of a sense that the stories contain truths that remain relevant, lessons that still need learning, connections that still need making. Dean Martin's estate is gone, but the questions it raises about work and wealth, about memory and forgetting, about who gets remembered and who gets erased, those questions remain. And they will remain long after the current mansion on Mountain Drive is also dust, replaced by something newer, bigger, and just as temporary as everything that came before.